Welcome to Leadership Unlocked, an interview-style podcast where leaders share insights about their leadership journey and experiences. I'm your host, Craig Bulmer, a people and capability specialist whose purpose is to create opportunities to optimize people's performance. Welcome to Leadership Unlocked. This is the first episode for 2025, and I'm joined by Claire Gray. So, hi, Claire. Thanks for joining me on the first episode of the year.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Well, I think you reached out to me. Am I right in saying that?
I did. So I was looking at leadership podcasts to go on, and your podcast came up pretty quickly. So yeah.
Well, I've just been notified that we're apparently one of the top 40 podcasts in the country now. So I'm not sure how that algorithm was worked out, but hey,
well, congratulations. That's a huge. Goes to show that you've obviously got good content that people want to hear.
We've got some really good guests. I think we've done well with the mixture of guests from leaders, from people like Michael from Bunnings and so forth, and then people like yourself who've written books, and we come from a different angle. So it's a good mixture of people that we're having on board, which is great. So Claire, let me hand it over to you for a few minutes. You get to pitch who you are, a little bit about your experience, and I know you've got a book and you want to tell us about that book. So you can tell us about that as well. Go for it.
Awesome. Thanks, Craig. So my name's Claire Gray. I've got a consultancy business called Thriving Culture. So we really specialise in leadership and team development. So we've got a Thriving Leaders program, which is really about building confidence in leaders, and we do that in a number of different ways. We also do one-on-one coaching, but we do a lot of work with leadership teams. So we work with leadership teams to help them have the conversations that they're not having. They might be a siloed leadership team. They might be getting complacent because they've been in their roles for a long time, or there might be some other dysfunction. So it's really to help those leadership teams talk about what they're not talking about and work on real business challenges together. And that's the basis actually of my second book, which I'm in the process of writing, which is called Thriving Teams. But I also have my book, which came out a couple of years ago, called Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. So that's a bit about me. I'm originally a Melbourne girl, moved up to Byron Bay nearly 8 years ago, and live here with my husband and my two boys.
That's a big move, Byron Bay.
Yeah, we did the sea change. So I think after we'd had our first child, we're rugged up in Melbourne, and I feel like it's cold for about 8 to 9 months of the year, and we love the beach and weren't really tapping into all that Melbourne has to offer. And so we decided to, give it a year. So when I went on my second mat leave, we thought we would give it a crack. So it's really good. We moved up when my youngest was 5 weeks old. So he's our yardstick of how long we've been here, and he's about to turn 8. So,
wow. Yeah. Brilliant. Now, take this the right way. Obviously, people can't see you because we're doing this on Zoom. You're quite young.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my birthday tomorrow, and I don't feel so old. I'm about to turn 41. So, but thank you. Thank you for saying that.
That's all right. You're 41. You do look younger than that, I'd have to say. And that's... I'm saying that purely from, well, what the hell is your experience? I was thinking, how does a 30-year-old bring something to the table?
I love you now.
I'm being serious. So yeah, you will have some experience. So tell us a little bit about your experience and what kind of led you to come from that experience into being a bit of a whiz on this thriving culture.
Yeah. So my background was in people and culture business partnering. So I worked at NAB for 10 years, which was a great organisation to work at. And before that, I'd worked over in the UK in human resources as well. And I had a Bachelor of Behavioural Science. And it was interesting because I think, I'd moved into sitting on senior leadership teams, supporting, I think my smallest client group was about 400 employees up to about 1,200 employees. And so I was always advising general managers and EGMs on how to lead, but I'd never actually led myself. And then when I finally moved into a leadership role, which was probably, 14 years ago now, 15 maybe, I actually had to practice what I was preaching, and it was hard, and so I actually got to practice the skills. I think, growing up in a great company like NAB that has really fabulous people processes and best practice in terms of how they develop their leaders was a really good building block for me in terms of learning the skills that leaders need. And I'm talking about some of the fundamentals around, you know, building self-awareness and understanding yourself, leveraging your strengths, you know, how to build a thriving team, how to have the difficult conversations, hold people accountable. And so was really kind of the cornerstone to a lot of the work that I did. When we did move up to Byron, I left NAB and started doing virtual coaching and facilitation for another company. And then I started my own business about 6.5 years ago now.
Mm.
Was more on the people and culture business partnering side of things, but then I really niched into leadership and team development in the last 4.5 years. And in that time, I've really kind of solidified, you know, what I see as it takes to be a thriving leader through coaching leaders, and also just from my experience in the past. So that's kind of how I've got to where I've got to. But I feel, you know, when a birthday's coming up, you know, you feel like you're aging and getting older. So it's really lovely that you gave me that feedback because I don't feel so young anymore.
Too funny. So, just an aside, and it's not my point is not necessarily that valuable. I do love your branding. I think it's great, and I jumped on your website earlier this morning just to make sure I had a bit more in my head about who I was talking to, and I think there was a pop-up, and there was a beautiful model. I think it was your Thriving Leaders model with the triangle,
Yeah.
and that looks great, by the way. It just looks amazing. So congratulations on that. So
Yeah, thank you. And that's the basis of my book. So when I wrote the book, I wrote it quite quickly because I was already delivering it as a leadership development program.
yeah,
But how I actually came up with the model was looking through all my coaching notes of what leaders wanted to be coached on and the areas that they felt like that they were either lacking or wanted to, you know, strengthen, that helped to really kind of form that model. And I've tested it
beautiful.
over time before I even wrote the book. So I know it's tried and tested.
No, it looks amazing. So tell me then, you said earlier when in this question and answer that it was hard to transition from being part of a team to now leading a team. You hadn't led and you moved into a role. What was hard about it?
I think it's easy to say, oh, you need to have difficult conversations. You need to hold people accountable. You need to take a coaching approach. But then actually, you know, building it into your practice of how you lead can be challenging because you often get promoted into a leadership role because of your technical capability. And I think the stat is that most leaders actually move into their first role between 30 to 35, but don't actually have any training until about 40 to 45. So most
Oh,
people, like I was, you know, well, you know, are learning, you know, to sink or swim. I think I was in a different position because I knew all the theory, but I hadn't
yeah,
really practiced the theory. So it was
sure.
about actually practicing what I was preaching. And I think that was challenging because, you know, personally, like one of the things I found challenging was you know, I'd always been in a consultant type of role, a, you know, trusted business advisor type of role. So I was very good at giving people the answer and telling them what they should do. And for me, and why I ended up becoming an executive coach was I saw the power in coaching and actually shifting to asking questions rather than telling people.
Yeah.
Like for me, that was probably one of the fundamental leadership shifts I had.
Yeah, because it's always difficult when you've got a pain in the backside
Mm,
of an employee really pushing your own personal buttons, and you're
yeah,
trying to implement the grow technique or whatever it might be. A wonderful technique, by the way. I love
yeah.
to all stuff, but but if they're pressing your buttons, it's very difficult not to say, "Hey, just do as I'm telling you to do, mate."
Well, definitely, definitely. And I think uh, there's a level of emotion that comes into it as well. Like you know, helped leaders recruit, but then even when you recruit someone that's going to be in your own team, and even now recruiting someone that's going to be in my own business, you know,
Mm,
there's this emotion that comes with it as well.
sure.
Whereas you can kind of separate it when you're in a HR role or something like that. There's a bit of separation, whereas I think there's a lot more emotion and it becomes a lot more personal.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're saying that it's very easy to say to use the vernacular, like you've got to come from a coaching perspective, or you've got to show empathy, or you've got to do, and it's harder to do than it is as easy as it is to say. But how do you transition into that? How do you implement what you know in a way that is authentic and gets results?
Yeah.
That's a tough question. Sorry.
No, no, no. I think it's a good question. It's often where I start in my leadership development programs, and it's the first part of the Thriving Leaders model is about understanding yourself. Like the more you understand about yourself, the better you can understand about others. Because I think the concept of authenticity is a challenging one. There's a bit of a paradox to that because you don't
Mm,
want to necessarily uh, be all things to all people, and you want to be true to yourself as well, and you want to balance that in a way that's really authentic to you. And so it's about like how do you dial up and dial down different parts of your personality based on the situation and bring what's required of you in the situation. And the reality is you're not always going to get it right, but it's about how do you actually in the moment have that self-awareness to be able to pivot and shift as well. So for
mm,
example, it might be a situation where you're having a difficult conversation with someone and you need to be assertive, but their response might come back and they might be quite emotional. And so you might then need to dial up being more empathetic. And so I think it's really about being able to understand what's happening in that situation and the type of leader you want to be as well. Because I think one of my biggest learnings personally as a leader is how do you be intentional in terms of how you're leading and how do you actually reflect on, well, what type of leader do I want to be and how do I
mm.
actually show up and do that? Because you're not always going to succeed with that. The reality is we're humans. The beauty of being human is we all have our flaws. We don't always behave how we intend to behave, but just being intentional and coming back and reflecting on that when we haven't shown up in the way that we wanted to.
What do you mean by intentional?
So, a really awesome exercise that I like to do is creating a leadership intention, like actually reflecting on what are my strengths and what do I value? What is my purpose in terms of being a leader and actually coming up with an intention statement, a leadership intention, uh, so that you can be very deliberate in how you're leading. Because I think for me, if I reflect early on in my career, I'm naturally a very fast paced person. You can probably tell by the way I speak. I speak fast, I think fast. Uh, I I think I was often in autopilot and actually pausing and being a little bit more intentional and thoughtful about how I'm actually going to lead in that moment.
So yeah, because I think the danger with that, I'm a bit similar to you, is you become very task focused, and rather than people focused. Then if you're not as a leader, people focused can be
Mm.
slightly problematic.
Yeah. And by intentional, I kind of think it's more about being rather than doing, like
Mm.
being intentional in how I'm going to be in this moment, how I'm going to
Oh,
show up. So being less about the task and being more about the how.
yeah. Okay. And how do you have an intention statement that you've used before for yourself? Or do you still have that?
I do, and it's kind of evolved over time in terms of the leader I want to be. I mean, it's about 6 sentences, so I can't kind of relay it off my top of my head, but it links to my personal values.
Yeah. Great.
It links to what I believe a thriving leader should be, and that's based on reflecting on where I've observed great leadership from others in the past, and it's quite aspirational. And it's something that I've shared with my team before. And it's something in my leadership development programs I ask leaders to share with their teams so they can hold uh, their both either their peers, if it's the team that they're a part of or the team that they lead, they can hold them accountable to that. Because it's
Yeah.
not, and it's an opportunity to show some vulnerability because we know that we don't always, show up in the way that we intend, but it's just about putting that out there.
And when you're doing your programs for organizations, are people self-selecting in that they're self-selecting to come into the course, or is it organizational, right, we're going to do a leadership program, and so therefore you would have people in the room going, I don't need this, I'm fine.
Yeah, it's a
What do
bit
you
of a
think?
mixture. So I've got my Thriving Leaders program that's to the public, so people tend to enroll on that, and I do love facilitating that. It's only small numbers that we get through each year because it is quite
Yeah.
an intimate program. But I would say, all people there have chosen to be there,
Yeah.
and then but most of my work comes from either corporate or not for profit or government clients where it is a program that people have either had to go through a selection process to get on, or it's been something they've been told they have to do.
Okay.
And, if I think of, a few years ago and a mining client, There was a lot of crossed arms of people who were like, what, who's this person from Byron Bay coming here to tell us how to lead?
Some
Have you
young
ever been on a,
30-year-old.
yeah, really young, no, no. And then it's a matter of, how long it will take until I can get them to uncross their arms because
Yeah.
they can see value in what we're talking about and seeing that we can leverage their experience too, because it's about also sharing stories of
Yeah,
what's worked for
absolutely.
leaders in the room and contextualizing it.
And do you use some kind of diagnostic to do the understanding self?
Yeah, so I do. So I use a tool called Facet 5, which is based on the Big Five theory of
Oh,
personality.
okay, nice.
And so that's the reason I like that tool is uh, tools like DISC and MBTI are great tools. However, they miss
Ish.
one of the key facets of the Big Five theory of personality, which is emotionality, and that influences the other four facets. So
Yeah, yeah.
it is about how do people emotionally react and respond. But I also like it because it's not overly complex. It's
Yeah.
still really helpful, both from a work perspective, and it's good to talk about teaming. So I use that as a tool. And if I'm helping people come up with an intention, I like to use the Values in Action survey, which is a
Oh,
free
yeah.
survey that you can use
Yeah.
based on Martin Seligman's work, because
Yeah.
that's about your values in action. So that's another diagnostic to help build that self-awareness too.
Yeah, nice. It's nice that somebody's using I haven't heard of Facet 5, but I know the Big Five.
Mm,
But I guess that's an influence from your degree, right? Because they're going to say, yeah, we do a lot of stuff in DISC, and I love DISC. I think it's a great, simple model, and it works well. If you look at the science behind it, many psychologists would suggest that it doesn't really stand up, where Big
mm,
Five does stand up.
yeah,
Uh, it stands up very well, in fact. So that's
yeah,
exciting. It's exciting
yeah,
to hear somebody using that. That's
yeah.
good for you. That's awesome.
Thanks.
And so you said earlier that there are certain things that kept coming up about what people wanted to be coached in or trained in or to develop. What are some of those things?
Yeah, definitely. Often leaders were looking at either needing to be more assertive or less assertive, or being more
Mm,
empathetic or less empathetic. And so when I think about authenticity, I think about it as a bit of a dial about uh, empathetic leadership, assertive leadership, and adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership is really about learning your way forward. And so often there's coaching around those things. Often there's coaching, even at really senior levels, about helping to manage dysfunctions within leadership teams, whether that's about teams operating in silos,
mm,
teams, uh, interpersonal differences between team members and us and them that can happen. I was coaching a lot of leaders about, having those difficult conversations and creating a culture of accountability. Like, how do we actually get our team members to want to take ownership from an accountability perspective? And I'm actually exploring a model at the moment as I'm writing my next book, Thriving Teams, because part of the Thriving Teams model is on accountability. And it's looking at our individual accountability, our mutual accountability between team members, and then the collective accountability, like that
mhm.
systemic accountability.
Yeah.
So this is actually the first time I'm talking out loud about it rather than in my head. So so exploring accountability is another one, and helping to lead and manage people through change. Like I think last year there was a lot of disruption, and I think last year was interesting. I think I got asked to do a lot of training on leading people through ambiguity rather than managing people
Mm,
through change. And it's like, how do
mm,
you actually keep people productive when you're going through change yourself? How
mm.
do you uh, keep people productive when you don't necessarily always have the answers to? Because either change is taking a really, really long time to come to fruition, or it might be there's change on change on change, and there's just so much happening all at once.
Because
So they was,
I feel
yeah,
like, sorry, I feel
no,
like,
no,
uh, I feel like ambiguity is probably the most common issue that we have right now.
I
Uh,
think it really is.
we change, yes, change is a bit old. It was before COVID, and now after COVID, I think we do have so much ambiguity around
Mm.
what are we doing this week, what are we doing next month, what are we doing next year, and that can change very, very quickly.
Yeah. And
It
even if you
has
think
to.
about like strategy, like facilitating a 10-year
Oh
strategy
my
seems
Lord.
almost impossible. Like, just 3 years seems like a long, long time
Long
as
time.
well. So, yeah, that ambiguity and having that comfort with the discomfort and being able to communicate to your teams what's actually what you can and what you can't, and when you don't have the answer. And it's okay not
Mm.
to have the answer, but providing a bit of certainty to people about when you're going to come back to them with more information, because that provides some certainty for them when they feel uncertain.
Yeah.
Mm.
And we know, that that's what people struggle with. They struggle with uncertainty, right? Uh,
Mm.
and understandably, if they've got mortgages or kids and schooling and all of that, then that's actually really
Mm.
important for them, right?
Yeah. And I think that, like, if we think about the ambiguity, like, if we think about what's happened over the last few years, like in 2023, I think a lot of leaders avoided having difficult conversations and holding people accountable because there was so much movement in the market. They were trying to retain their people so they could get their work done. There was
Mm.
the psychosocial safety legislation that came out in Australia. They didn't want to be seen as being a bully. And then last year, there was so much ambiguity, but they also needed to get work done and do more with less. And so it was like relearning the skill of having difficult conversations and giving feedback and holding
Mm.
people accountable, as well as trying to lead people through ambiguity. And it's no surprise. Like, I think statistically, Ari had posted an article late last year about the fact that in Australia, there's 500 leaders retiring every day. But only 4% of the workforce actually wants to move into leadership positions. So we don't have a very good pipeline of people wanting to be leaders because it feels so hard. Leaders are getting more burnt out than their people. And so it's not as attractive as it was in the past to be a leader.
And I'm also seeing a proliferation of people wanting to work for themselves.
Mm,
Everybody's trying to be an entrepreneur, and
yeah.
and they're not wanting to have they don't want to lead. They just want to, I guess, buy themselves a job in many ways, but they're not, yeah, they're not keen at all. They just want to
Mm.
look after themselves.
It's actually quite interesting because I was actually on a webinar earlier in the week around with gig workers about that topic. And apparently, this is one of the first years, I think the last 2 years, there was a real push for people doing gig work. And this year, it's really quietened down. A lot of
Mm.
people are going back from doing the gig work back to some more stability in terms of permanent roles because the economic climate's quite challenging. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens in 2025 in that regard, because I think there almost feels like there's a little bit of a shift going back. But I definitely agree. The last couple of years, there's been more and more people doing gig work.
I feel like they have to go back because they can't sustain it. You can't have that many entrepreneurs out there with
Mm.
products that are going to be that successful. We know the stats around that. I think it's only 2 or 3% of
Mm.
ideas actually coming to fruition. And economically, we're seeing it's going to be a tough year again.
Yeah.
So economically, if you're going to survive, you're going to have to be in some kind of permanent role, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Australia after the federal budget at the end of March, whether that helps people's confidence in terms
Yeah,
of uh, the economic climate just in general.
yeah. Now, if I've heard you right, you talk about accountability, and lots of people talk, use all these words, accountability and so forth. Uh, what I think I heard was this idea of a dial, where it's kind of one end of the dial or the other end of the dial, or it's in the middle. Can you just explain that a little bit more? Because I quite like where you're coming from with that idea.
Yeah. So I might make two comments. I'll start
Okay.
off. So I've got a dial around authenticity, and then I've got a model around accountability. So
Okay.
yeah. So if I talk
Perfect.
about authenticity I see as being a kind of a dial in three parts around empathetic leadership. So kind of putting yourself in other people's shoes, treating people as humans, being assertive. So actually having the tough conversations, having a clear direction, giving people that North Star. And then adaptive, which is about, as leaders, we often face technical challenges that we have experienced before, but we also have adaptive leadership challenges, which are new things we haven't experienced before, and we have to learn our way forward. And there's more and more need for more adaptive leadership in workplaces in general. So if you think about them being like empathy, being like your heart, assertive being head, and adaptive being your gut is a good way to think about it. And often people have a natural tendency to be head, heart, or gut, or empathetic, assertive, or adaptive. and that you kind of have to dial up and dial down what that looks like for you. Because Craig's
Yeah.
version of assertive leadership might look different to Claire's version of assertive leadership. And so it's about finding a kind of what suits your style so you can actually bring that to the situation when you need to.
It's interesting because for me, and it has for years, the word assertive grates on me. I
Mm.
find the word assertive aggressive.
Yeah, it's
Not
interesting,
the
isn't
meaning.
it?
I just the sound of the word. What is it?
Yeah,
Is it onomatopoeia when the sound of the anyway?
yeah.
Uh, yeah, I really find assertive is aggressive. It's a pity we haven't come up with a better term, but anyway,
Word,
I
yeah. I
digress.
actually quite like assertive because I think it's a nice way that we can be more direct.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's you and
But
me.
yeah, but that's probably because I'm more of an assertive person. So
Yeah,
there you
that's
go.
I can see that's you
Yeah.
and I right there.
But going to the question around accountability, it's funny
Yes.
you say that you find the word assertive grating because I think that there's three words at work that people find, like I say that they're the dirty words at work.
Sure.
One's feedback, because often when people hear feedback, they just have like the hairs on their back of their neck stand on end because they think about a time that they've had negative feedback. Performance. Some people, when they hear the word performance, like when I facilitate and I talk about performance, they think about uh, a time that, like, you know, that someone's going to be performance managed or they're going through a PIP process. And then accountability is the other one. And they think about being blamed, being micromanaged. Whereas
Yeah.
I think these three words are really positive. I think about feedback as being an opportunity to learn and grow. I think about performance being about being at our best and like delivering really great outcomes. And accountability is a privilege. You know, if someone's giving you accountability, they trust you to get something done. They're giving you ownership. And so it should be seen as a privilege. And it's funny because, you know, just like you said with assertive being a negative connotation, I can see how when I say those words, when I facilitate to people, it grinds them because they've got this negative connotation to them. And like one of the things I really want to focus on is shifting people's perception of the word accountability, or even changing how people use the word accountability so it isn't just a way to persecute someone or make someone feel like they've done the wrong thing. It's actually
Yeah,
a
I'm trying to,
positive.
in my head, I'm just trying to come up with a question for you around that because I'm going, so I'll think out loud here, it may not come
Yeah.
out perfectly. So it sounds like, has accountability become a negative word because leaders have used it and they have micromanaged?
Mm.
Uh, is that part of the reason why it's somewhat negative? Because it is a privilege to be given a task and to do it and to do it well and take ownership of it. I'm curious why we've ended up with this negative connotation around the word
Yeah, I
ability.
think it's a number of reasons. I think culturally it can be because there's finger pointing and blame when things don't
Mm,
go well, and someone has to uh, take the heat for that.
yeah.
I think sometimes it can be because a leader has micromanaged because they do have a bit of a fear. And I think when the market was pretty crazy in 2023, people were recruiting people that didn't quite have the capabilities for roles because there were so many roles on the market. People were doing the roles of the people below them because they didn't have the
Mm,
capability within their teams. And so people felt disempowered as well. So they felt like they had a lack of accountability. But there's often an underlying issue when there's this perceived lack of accountability. And it can often be because we haven't ensured that they have the capability to do what's expected of them. We haven't set clear expectations of what we want.
yeah, right.
You know, there's a number of reasons, it's underlying reasons when there can be a lack of accountability. But I also think there's a number of reasons why there's this negative connotation to accountability. And I really want to change it because I think it's positive.
Are you going to change the word?
No, not going to change the
You're
word,
going to
just
come up with
people's
a different
perception of the
term?
word. No.
I'm thinking you've got a new dictionary item.
Well, I would love that, but it's interesting. So, like in my model of the four C's of accountability, the last C initially was consequences. And there's three different types of consequences, but people don't like the word consequence
No
talking
way.
about.
Not if we're talking about the negative connotation of it, right?
Yeah, because consequences, there's positive consequences to
Yeah,
things
right.
and there's
Absolutely.
negative consequences. So I changed the last C to communicating outcomes. But whenever I deliver it, I also let people know that it really means consequences and that it is, you know, and there's three R's to that. You know, there is reinforcing, like a positive consequence. There's a redo so that someone can actually learn for themselves rather than you doing it for them.
Mm,
And the last part is about release, which is, you know, sometimes someone isn't the right fit for that piece of work or they're not the right fit for the role. And that is a negative consequence to that situation. But in the long run, no one wants to be a square peg in a round hole. And it's better off for that individual, for the organization, for the team, if you do address that. And I know I make it sound very simple, but there are consequences for accountability. And I think we avoid accountability and consequences because it feels like the word assertive feels to you.
Well, there's other pressures, isn't there, for leaders? Often I come across leaders that they know that they may have to get this square peg out of a round hole and move them into another role or move them on. But the consequence of that action is typically I don't have a person in a role and I need people in a role because we're too busy doing X or too busy doing Y. And it's actually better if I have a bad bum on my seat than an empty bum on the seat.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting what the impact of that is to the rest of the team too. And, there's nothing wrong with having a safe pair of hands. Like, I'm not saying that we don't want to have a safe pair of hands within a team. But often when we step over issues, the team notices that we're not facing into someone not pulling their weight within the team and that you're avoiding having a difficult conversation. It gets noticed.
Yeah, I agree. And that's when you talk about, well, the terminology years ago was it becomes a bit of a cancer and it starts to spread throughout the organization, which is not great.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to be slightly vulnerable for me for a bit now.
Oh, yes.
Didn't tell you that.
Right.
When you were leading, tell me about a situation where you've stuffed up.
Yeah.
And you've gone, that just didn't work. As much as you can. Don't say people's names, of course. But
yeah, don't be that vulnerable. No. Oh, look, I've made a lot of mistakes along the way.
Is there one that kind of plays in your mind a lot, though? When you think about what you're writing and what you're doing now?
Yeah. I mean, there's probably a few things that come to mind. I think for me, and probably why I push facing into issues sooner rather than later, is probably leaving things to play out for a long time and not facing into issues that I've had with team members sooner. And sometimes we avoid it, hoping it will get better itself. And sometimes that's quite naive. So actually giving feedback early, because we can't assume people can read our minds.
Yeah.
And we get frustrated. And I think the other thing for me is I'm a pretty open book. And I know that, probably learnt the hard way that when I am frustrated, that does come through in my tone of voice. So being quite conscious of when's the right time to give the feedback, not when you're still frustrated. And it's something that I'm really passionate about. Others understanding that, like, unless you want someone to learn and grow, it's probably not the right time to be giving the feedback yourself.
And what was some of the consequences you had when you didn't handle things earlier than you could have?
I think like you feel the tension. You feel the tension or the unsaid that's not spoken about. And maybe that's why I'm so passionate about raising some of those unsaids now, because I experienced some of those myself. Another thing that I reflect on is also like being in a role where and I'm actually writing about this in the book at the moment that I'm working through at the moment, is I recall being, a people and culture business partner and sitting on a leadership team, but I was also part of people and culture as well. And so kind of when you've got multiple homes and you're part of multiple teams, it's really easy to kind of side with one of them.
Right,
create this us and them, and that's so annoying. Now it's convenient for me now to be on this side, and how much I leaned into that was probably not helpful. And how do you actually shift your mindset to having more of a one team mindset than an us and them mindset is something that I know I was a part of in the past. And so it's how you observe that in the future. And obviously I don't work now in a big organization that I have that dynamic personally, but I work with a lot of clients that have that challenge. And so I really relate to that.
I think that can happen personally though, Claire. Like,
yeah.
It's interesting you say, because I know that even even now, just personal, it's very easy for you to go, somebody's talking about something and go, yeah, 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 oh, that person shouldn't be, or that person shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Think later on, why did I take that side? And there's
Yeah.
obviously something about being liked or being connected or belonging and so forth. But
Yeah.
it's an intriguing habit of a human being that it's very easy to go, I'll side here, and then I'm siding here, and then I'm siding there. It's
Yeah. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think there's this link to belonging, like,
mm,
because it creates distance from something else, and then you feel like you belong, and then all those things come into play. And so I think one of the outcomes of uh, being part of a team is getting that sense of belonging. And I think that really comes through with having strong relationships around psychological safety and trust. And I think the outcome of that is that sense of belonging. But how do you do it in a way that builds a one team mindset versus us and them? Because I
yeah,
think that that's like, you know, organizations are always being siloed in different ways. And it's something that I'm kind of building on the work of Patrick Lencioni, because he talks about, you know, your first team or primary team. And I come at it from a slightly different angle, because I feel like that's almost like picking between your children,
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know, and having a
Who's your favorite
favorite.
child?
Yeah, who's your favorite? It depends on the day, let's be honest. But it's the but it's more than that, because I think you want to have a one team mindset rather than a first team and a primary team mindset. And I think that that's the shift that you need to have. It kind of makes you lift the gaze and um, sit above the team to make decisions for the greater good of the whole. But the reality is, you know, we're humans, we're going to have judgments, and we're going to have more alignment, or uh, whether that's values alignment, or it could be more task alignment with different areas based on what we're doing as well. So I think there's a reality that comes with it.
It's there's a few things that you said that, so if people have never heard of Patrick Lencioni, wonderful stuff around five dysfunctions of success,
Five dysfunctions of a team.
of a
Yeah.
team, isn't it? Five
Yeah.
dysfunctions of a team. That's a cracking read, actually.
Yeah. It's probably the most popular book on teams. The only limitation I would say with that model is that it looks at the team very insular, and teams are part of a complex adaptive system. You can't be successful in isolation. You need to be successful with your stakeholders. And that's probably one of the limitations
Was he
of the
out
model.
here last year?
I believe so. And the growth faculty are
Both
doing
faculty had him.
a
Yes, that's
session with
right.
him again, I think next month.
And then the other thing, as you talk, that comes to mind is this concept of emotionality that you talked about from the big five, or the facet five. Is like
Yeah.
all of this stuff says, yeah, 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 accountability, being empathetic and whatever. But what's our own emotions, and how do they get pushed, driven,
Mm.
all through all of this? And it's
Mm.
understanding that, I think, is really, really important.
Because you think about decision making, and I know that, you know, we constantly say, oh, I'm making fact-based decisions and all these things, but all the research shows us that at the end of the day, at the very end, it's an emotional decision that ends up prevailing as well. Like, we take all the data points in, and, you know, if we use De Bono's six thinking hats and all that kind
Yeah,
of stuff, you
sure.
know, it still
Yeah.
says that at the end of the day, the decision will be an emotional one. And
Yeah, and
so
I
we can't
trust my
pretend it's not something that's going to influence us.
yeah, I trust my gut a
Mm.
lot. I
Yeah.
think it still provides us with good information and good data and good feeling. I think that's
Mm.
really important.
That
So
intuitive. Yeah.
yeah, I think, take the data in and then process it, sit on it, and see where it lands for you. So interesting. So if you were coaching a young leader now, some of these gig workers that are coming back into the workforce,
Yeah.
and we maybe they're aspiring leaders, perhaps, what would be three tips that you would give them?
Yeah. Three tips I'd give an aspiring leader, or who's moving into their first leadership role. Probably the first one would be exploring how to take more of a coaching approach in the conversations that you have.
Hmm.
So, something really simple and tangible that you can do could be asking more what or how questions.
Yeah.
So, kind of, I know personally I was a real rescuer, and then I was like, oh no, I'm a good coach when I was a leader, because I asked heaps of questions, but they were really leading questions like, have you done this? Could you do this? Have you thought about this? And so they really weren't actually questions at all. I was actually being very directive.
Questions with solutions in them.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
actually, how could you just ask a what or a how question to get someone to solve their problem for themselves? So that's probably the first uh, thing that I would suggest. Probably the second one would be when you are giving feedback to someone and you are frustrated, angry, annoyed, go for a walk, blow off your steam in another way until you feel like you've got some positive intentions, like you want the person to understand or you want them to learn and grow. Then that's the time to actually face into to having that feedback conversation. Yeah. And probably the other one is like get to know your people and what drives them, what motivates them, what their strengths are. Uh, so that you can connect the work that they do every day to things that light them up in terms of their strengths or what they value, and just
I
trying to
think
make that
that's
connection
huge.
regularly.
I think that's huge. I don't think we do that enough. I
Mm.
often hear leaders saying, "Oh, they only go to work from 9 to 5, and they don't put any more of an effort in." But there are people that's what they want to do, and they're very
Yeah.
happy doing 9 to 5, and they can do 9 to 5 beautifully. They
Yeah.
don't necessarily have the aspiration or to
Mm.
do more, and it's okay. But because we don't take the time to understand them, we
Yeah.
then look at it negatively, and it's not
Mm.
necessarily a negative thing.
And especially if someone is like reaching retirement age and they don't want to progress, or they're just happy at being at the level that they are, it can be something that can be really motivating for them. Is how do they impart some of their knowledge to new team members or other people? So thinking about and valuing the knowledge and the skills that everyone has within their team is really important.
Yeah, nice. Claire, it's been awesome talking to you and coming up to our time already, but I feel like I could talk longer. One thing I would say to those that are listening is, and this is another compliment, is Claire is incredibly authentic right now. I can tell you she's just so authentic. It's incredible. So get on and have a look at a book, Thriving Leaders. Look out for the new one, which is going to be called Thriving
Teams.
Teams.
Yeah.
So that's coming. So in the essence of authenticity, what's something that we don't know about you that you're willing to share?
Oh, I don't even know what to share. You've thrown me.
I know.
What don't you know about me? I probably lots of things. Like normally, like my fun, useless fact that I share when I facilitate to get people talking is that I can sing the alphabet backwards.
Oh,
So
you
my
do
year
that.
four primary school teacher thought that was a really useful skill to look things up in the dictionary from the back and the front quickly.
Yes.
And like obviously she didn't see that the internet was coming and people Google how to spell words now. But
So
I've
you can
actually taught
sing
both
the
of my
alphabet.
boys to sing the alphabet backwards, so they can now sing the alphabet backwards. I had to wait for my youngest to learn it forwards before I could teach him
Sure.
it backwards because I thought that would be confusing. So yeah, so that's my useless skill that I
Yes, your
have.
fun fact.
Yeah,
A
that's
fun
my
fact
fun
about
fact.
Claire
But
Gray.
yeah, so there you go. I'm gonna
Thriving
have to come up with
cultures.
something new because I keep using that, and I probably need to come up with something a
Yeah,
bit.
I feel like that sometimes. I was like, oh, I've said that one enough.
Yeah, I have to think of something fresh. I'm feeling a bit boring that I don't have something more exciting to say.
2025. Come up with a fresh one.
Okay, that can be yeah, we're at a quarter of a century. I've probably used that for 25 years. So now, no.
And let us know. So if you want to get in touch with Claire, thrivingculture.com.au. As an outsider, some of her stuff looks amazing. The models look great. I hope that from the conversation we've just had with Claire, you get a feel for what she does and how she does it, because I think you're doing some pretty good stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Craig. It's been an awesome conversation.
And I'm happy to have you as one of our guests. So thanks so much.
Thanks.